Welcome to Cafe Tales, Miss Marple Snow in the Summerhouse. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Ailey. And isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. White Lace Lemonade and Snow in July. The late July sun beat down mercilessly upon the emerald lawns of Gossington Hall, where Lady Bantry had thrown open her gates for the annual St. Mary Mead summer fete. The very air seemed to shimmer with heat, and even the ancient oaks that bordered the property appeared to droop with exhaustion. Yet, despite the sweltering temperature, the grounds buzzed with activity as the good people of the village went about their charitable endeavors with that peculiarly British determination that refuses to acknowledge discomfort. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in the shade of a striped marquee, observed the proceedings with the gentle interest of one who has witnessed many such gatherings over the years. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty, though those who knew her well understood that her attention was far more occupied with the human drama unfolding around her than with the intricacies of cable stitch. "How perfectly charming," she murmured to Lady Bantry, who had paused in her hostess duties to fan herself with a program. "The Women's Institute has quite outdone themselves this year." "Indeed," Lady Bantry replied, dabbing at her forehead with a lace handkerchief. "Mrs. Carmichael's idea. She felt we needed something novel to draw the crowds from Little Wickham. Their fete last week raised nearly $40, you know." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How very enterprising. Though I must say, the sight of snow in this heat makes one feel almost cool by suggestion." The artificial snow in question was, Miss Marple observed, nothing more than soap flakes scattered artfully about the stall, but the effect was charming nonetheless. Children pressed their noses against the display cases, filled with Christmas puddings and mince pies, while their parents purchased lemonade from an adjacent stand manned by Mrs. Iris Pierce, whose reputation for prize-winning preserves had made her the natural choice for beverage duties. "Fresh squeeze this morning," Mrs. Pierce was declaring to a small queue of perspiring customers. "Nothing but the finest lemons. And my secret is just a touch more zest than most would dare to use." Among those awaiting refreshment stood Mr. Ambrose Carow, a gentleman of middle years, who had recently taken up residence in one of the prettier cottages on the outskirts of the village. He was a man of genial appearance with a sort of prosperous bearing that immediately marked him as someone not born to country life, but rather escaped to it from London's commercial districts. His conversation, Miss Marple had noted during the brief introduction Lady Bantry had performed earlier, tended toward enthusiastic plans for improving various properties about the village. "Dreadful shame to see these old places falling into disrepair," he had confided to anyone within earshot. "With just a touch of modern sensibility and proper investment, we could make St. Mary Mead quite the showplace." His audience had received these pronouncements with the polite reserve that country folk reserve for newcomers bearing grand schemes. Miss Marple had observed the subtle stiffening of shoulders and the carefully neutral expressions that suggested Mr. Carow's vision of improvement might not align entirely with local sentiment. Near the Christmas stall, she noticed Claude Denim, sorting through a large brown paper parcel with the methodical care of one accustomed to handling theatrical properties. As quartermaster for the Parish Dramatic Society, Claude was responsible for the costumes and props that had graced St. Mary Mead's amateur productions for the better part of 2 decades. He was a thin, nervous man with prematurely gray hair and the sort of precise movements that spoke of someone who had spent years ensuring that curtains rose on time and actors found their marks. His wife Sylvia stood beside him, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and whose mouth seemed perpetually compressed into a line of disapproval. She was not, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of person one would choose for confidences. Yet there was an intelligence about her that suggested depths beneath her somewhat forbidding exterior. More snow for the display, Claude was explaining, to young Tom Briggs, Lady Bantry's gardener, who had paused in his duties to observe the proceedings. Tom was a shy lad of perhaps 19, with a sort of honest, open face that immediately inspired trust. His working clothes were dusty from his labors, and Miss Marple noticed that he had removed his boots in deference to the festivities, padding about in his wool socks with a careful tread of one conscious of his station. Soap flakes from the Mead dramatics cupboard, Claude continued, handling the parcel with theatrical reverence. We used them for the snow scene in last winter's production of A Christmas Carol. Perfectly serviceable for another appearance, I should think. The afternoon wore on with the gentle rhythm of country pleasures. Children shrieked with delight at the coconut shy. Ladies examined embroidered cushions with a critical eye of those who knew good needlework from poor, and gentlemen gravitated toward the beer tent with the purposeful stride of those seeking refuge from domestic obligations. Miss Marple found herself drawn repeatedly to observing Mr. Carow, who seemed to possess that peculiar gift for inserting himself into conversations where his presence was not entirely welcome. She watched him corner the vicar about the church roof fund, engage Mrs. Pierce in earnest discussion about her cottage garden, and approach Claude Denham with what appeared to be a business proposition of some urgency. It was just past 1 when Mr. Carow excused himself from a rather one-sided conversation with the president of the Mothers' Union. "Frightfully sorry," he declared, with the hearty bonhomie that had marked all his interactions that afternoon. "Must slip away for a moment to ring a call. Business, you understand? Shan't be but a few minutes." Miss Marple watched him make his way across the lawn toward the ivy-covered summerhouse that sat at the far end of Lady Bantry's gardens. It was a charming structure built in the previous century and maintained with the care that Lady Bantry bestowed upon all her properties. The afternoon heat had driven most of the festivities toward the shaded areas nearer the house, leaving the summerhouse isolated and peaceful. Perhaps 10 minutes later, young Tom Briggs came running across the lawn with the sort of urgency that immediately drew attention. His face was pale beneath its tan, and his usual diffidence had been replaced by obvious distress. "Lady Bantry," he called out, his voice carrying across the gentle murmur of the fete. "Lady Bantry, you must come quickly. It's Mr. Carow in the Summerhouse, I think he's dead." The cheerful sounds of the afternoon seemed to falter and fade as the implications of Tom's words settled upon the gathering. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with a careful deliberation of one who recognized that the pleasant routine of the day had given way to something far more serious. As she rose to follow Lady Bantry toward the summerhouse, her keen eyes noted the small details that others might overlook in their haste. The way Claude Denham's hands trembled as he set down his parcel, the sharp intake of breath from his wife Sylvia, and the curious fact that a light dusting of white flakes had somehow found their way from the Christmas stall to trail across the lawn in the direction of the ivy-covered building where Mr. Carow now lay still and silent in the summer heat. Chapter 2. The Prize Cup, the Closed Door. The summerhouse, which only moments before had seemed a picturesque retreat from the afternoon's festivities, now possessed an atmosphere of profound stillness that seemed to press upon those who approached it. Lady Bantry reached the ivy-covered structure first, her usual composure intact despite the circumstances, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her friend's hands as she grasped the door handle. "The door is closed," Lady Bantry observed, her voice carrying that peculiar note of surprise reserved for the unexpected in familiar surroundings. How very odd. It's never closed during the day in summer. Inspector Slack arrived with a huffing urgency of a man unused to rapid movement in excessive heat. His red face bore the expression of one who regarded any disruption to his routine as a personal affront. And the presence of a body at what should have been a pleasant village gathering clearly fell into this category of unwelcome complications. "Now then, what's all this about?" he demanded, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Young Briggs here says there's been some sort of accident." Tom stood to one side, his earlier panic now replaced by the sort of frozen uncertainty that overcomes the young when confronted with adult crises. His wool-stockinged feet shifted nervously on the flagstone path, and Miss Marple observed that his usually ruddy complexion had acquired a distinctly greenish cast. I was checking the roses along the back wall," Tom stammered. "The climbing ones, you know, Lady Bantry. They've been troubled with aphids this season. I thought I heard someone inside, talking perhaps, and then it went very quiet. When I looked through the window," he swallowed hard. "He's sitting in the wicker chair, Inspector. Just sitting there, but his eyes, they're open, but he's not moving at all." Inspector Slack approached the door with a measured tread of authority, though Miss Marple detected a certain reluctance in his manner. The thumb latch, she noticed, was down in the closed position, securing the door from within. "Locked from inside," Slack announced with evident relief. "Natural causes most likely. Heart. Seizure, I'd wager. This heat would try any man's constitution, particularly one of his years coming from London. These city types aren't accustomed to proper country air." He pushed against the door experimentally, but it held firm. The windows of the Summerhouse, charm casements with diamond panes, were likewise secured from within, their brass latches gleaming in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the ivy. "We'll need to force entry," Lady Bantry said quietly. "The spare key hangs in the garden shed, but it won't help if the thumb latch is engaged." Dr. Haydock arrived as Inspector Slack was preparing to shoulder the door, his medical bag in hand, and his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by professional gravity. He was a man who had attended births and deaths in St. Mary Mead for the better part of 30 years, and his presence lent an air of proper procedure to the proceedings. "Best let me have a look first," he suggested, peering through the nearest window. After a moment, he stepped back with a thoughtful frown. "Poor fellow, certainly gone. Sitting quite peacefully, though. Not the sort of contortion one usually sees with cardiac episodes." The door yielded to Inspector Slack's determined assault, with a splintering of wood around the latch mechanism. The interior of the Summerhouse exhaled the close, still air of a space that had been sealed against the summer breeze, carrying with it the mingled scents of wicker furniture, old cushions, and something else that Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. Mr. Ambrose Carow sat in the largest of the wicker chairs, positioned to command a view of the garden through the main window. His posture suggested a man who had simply settled back for a moment's rest, but the absolute stillness of his form and the fixed stare of his eyes told a different story entirely. On the small table beside him sat a pottery jug, the sort used for serving lemonade at garden parties, alongside a single glass tumbler that bore the telltale residue of recent use. The jug appeared to be perhaps half empty, and a few drops of pale liquid had splashed onto the scrubbed wooden surface of the table. "Lemonade," Inspector Slack observed with satisfaction. "Must have felt the heat and come in here for refreshment. Probably took a turn while he was drinking." But Miss Marple's attention had been captured by another detail entirely. Scattered across the rush matting that covered the floor was a light dusting of white flakes distributed with an almost artistic evenness that seemed strangely at odds with the randomness one might expect from accident or nature. The flakes had settled not only on the floor, but on the deceased's shoes as well, creating tiny drifts that caught the light streaming through the windows. "Snow," she murmured half to herself. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock looked up from his preliminary examination of the body. "The artificial snow from the Christmas stall," she explained, gesturing delicately toward the scattered flakes. "It seems to have found its way in here somehow." Lady Bantry moved closer to examine the phenomenon, her brow creased with puzzlement. "How very peculiar. There's been no wind to speak of today, and the door was closed. However did it get scattered about so evenly?" Near the overturned tumbler, Miss Marple noticed lay a small silver cup bearing an engraved inscription. Dr. Haydock carefully retrieved it, revealing the words, "Best lemon curd, St. Mary Mead's Institute, 1953, etched in flowing script. Mrs. Pierce's prize," Lady Bantry identified. "She won it just last month at the regional competition. However did it come to be here?" Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had begun his examination of the scene with the methodical thoroughness that marked his approach to official duties. He noted the position of the furniture, the contents of the deceased's pockets, and the apparent lack of any signs of struggle or violence. "Straightforward enough," he declared after several minutes of investigation. "Gentleman comes in here to escape the heat and make his telephone call. Helps himself to some lemonade, probably brought it with him from Mrs. Pierce's stall, and succumbs to the temperature. Heart gives out, glass drops from nerveless fingers, and there you have it." Dr. Haydock, however, appeared less certain. He had knelt beside the chair to conduct a closer examination, and his expression had grown increasingly troubled. "I'm not entirely convinced it's cardiac arrest," he said slowly. "The coloration is rather unusual, and there's a peculiar odor about him, something I can't quite place, but it's not entirely natural." Miss Marple had been studying the distribution of the white flakes with the sort of concentration she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. Something about their arrangement troubled her, though she could not immediately articulate what it was. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I suggest that you examine the thumb latch more closely?" Slack looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man who regarded civilian suggestions as necessary evils to be tolerated in the interest of maintaining community relations. "The latch, Miss Marple. What about it?" "Only that there appear to be several of these flakes resting on top of it," she replied, "which would suggest they were scattered after the door was secured rather than before." The observation hung in the air like a challenge to the neat explanation that Inspector Slack had constructed. Lady Bantry moved to examine the latch herself, her expression growing more perplexed as she confirmed Miss Marple's observation. "She's quite right," Lady Bantry said. "The flakes are sitting on the metal surface as if they'd been dusted there after the latch was engaged." Dr. Haydock rose from his examination with a grimace that spoke of aging joints and growing certainties. "I'll need to conduct a more thorough examination," he announced, "but I'm increasingly doubtful this was natural causes. There are signs that suggest some form of poisoning, though I can't be specific without proper analysis." Inspector Slack's face registered the sort of dismay reserved for complications that threatened to transform simple matters into complex investigations. "Poisoning," he repeated, "but the door was locked from inside. The windows were latched. How could anyone have administered poison and then escaped?" Miss Marple continued her quiet observation of the scene, her experienced eye cataloging details that might prove significant. The precise way the flakes had settled, the angle at which the silver cup had fallen, the curious absence of any disturbance in the room's arrangement despite the presence of a dying man. "That," she said softly, "is indeed the question, isn't it? though I suspect the answer may be rather more ingenious than it first appears. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the summer-house floor, highlighting the mysterious scatter of artificial snow, it became clear that what had begun as a pleasant village fete had transformed into something far more sinister. In the distance, the sounds of the celebration continued, unaware that death had paid an uninvited visit to the ivy-covered retreat at the garden's far end. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Ribbing in the Footprints. While Inspector Slack busied himself with the practical business of cordoning off the summer house and dispatching a constable to summon the police surgeon from Much Benham, Miss Marple remained within the ivy-covered structure, her sharp eyes moving methodically across the curious tableau before her. The artificial snow continued to fascinate her, not merely for its presence but for the peculiar manner of its distribution. She had withdrawn a small magnifying glass from her reticule, a tool that never failed to amuse Lady Bantry, who often teased her friend about playing at detective stories. Now, however, there was nothing amusing about the concentrated attention Miss Marple brought to bear upon the rush matting. The soap flakes, she observed, had settled in what appeared to be an entirely natural pattern, as though scattered by some vagrant breeze, yet the windows had been found latched, and the door secured from within. Moreover, the distribution struck her as remarkably even for something deposited by chance. Nature, in her experience, was rarely so methodical in its arrangements. "Most interesting," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles to better examine a particular area near the doorway. Dr. Haydock, who had been making notes in his pocketbook, glanced up with professional interest. "Found something significant, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps," she replied, her voice carrying that note of cautious speculation that those who knew her had learned to respect. "It's the footprints in the powder, you see, or rather the lack of what one might expect to find." She indicated the area around the threshold where the soap flakes lay most thickly. Here, impressed into the white dust, were several distinct sets of footprints, the clear treads of outdoor shoes that had obviously been worn by those who had entered the summer house earlier in the day. 4 different patterns, Miss Marple observed, counting carefully. 3 sets of men's shoes, judging by the size and shape, and 1 pair of ladies' walking boots, rather sensible ones with a distinctive heel pattern. Inspector Slack, drawn by the conversation, approached with the weary resignation of a man accustomed to Miss Marple's observations, proving more pertinent than he cared to acknowledge. "Footprints are footprints," he said dismissively. "People came in and out during the day. Nothing mysterious about that." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But you see, Inspector, there's also this curious set here, just inside the door." She pointed to a series of fainter impressions that showed none of the deep tread marks of the others. Instead, these prints displayed a fine ribbed pattern, as though made by someone wearing wool stockings or very thin sole shoes. Lady Bantry leaned forward to examine the marks Miss Marple indicated. "How very odd. They're much lighter than the others, aren't they? Almost as if whoever made them was trying to walk quietly, or," Miss Marple suggested gently, "as if they were made by someone wearing wool socks rather than proper shoes. The ribbing, you see, it's quite distinctive, rather like the pattern one finds in men's work socks." Dr. Haydock knelt to examine the prints more closely, his medical eye appreciating the careful observation. "You're quite right. The pattern is entirely different from shoe leather. But who would be walking about in their stocking feet?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted thoughtfully toward the windows, where the afternoon sun continued to stream through the diamond panes, illuminating the scattered flakes with an almost ethereal quality. Something about the light caught her attention, a subtle disturbance in the even distribution of the artificial snow that she had not previously noticed. "Inspector Slack," she said, her tone carrying a new note of urgency. "Might I draw your attention to the inner door latch once more?" Slack approached with obvious reluctance, but his expression changed as he followed Miss Marple's pointing finger. Resting on top of the brass mechanism were several flakes of the artificial snow, positioned as though they had fallen there after the latch had been engaged. "That's impossible," he muttered. "If the door was locked from inside when the fellow died, these flakes would have been scattered before he secured the latch, not after." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, "which suggests that either Mr. Caro scattered the snow himself after locking the door, a rather unlikely scenario given his subsequent demise, or someone else arranged for it to be distributed after the room was sealed." Dr. Haydock had returned his attention to the deceased, conducting a more thorough examination than his initial assessment had permitted. The peculiar odor that had first troubled him seemed more pronounced now that the room had been opened and the air allowed to circulate. "I'm increasingly convinced we're dealing with some form of toxic substance," he announced. "The symptoms are becoming clearer as I examine him more carefully. There's a distinctive smell about him. Bitter, rather, like burnt almonds, though not quite that. It's more medicinal." "Medicinal?" Miss Marple inquired, her interest sharpening. "Yes, rather like some of the compounds we use for treating garden pests. Nicotine solutions, perhaps, or one of the newer insecticides. They can be quite lethal in sufficient concentration, particularly if administered in liquid form." "Inspector?" Slack's notebook emerged once more, his pencil poised with new purpose. "Insecticide poisoning, you think? But how would he have ingested it? The only liquid in here is that lemonade, and Mrs. Pierce has been serving from the same jug to half the village without anyone else falling ill." Miss Marple had moved to examine the pottery jug more closely, her magnifying glass once again proving its worth. The vessel appeared to be one of a set used regularly at Gossington Hall for outdoor entertaining. Sturdy, practical pieces designed to withstand the rigors of garden parties and village fetes. "The lemonade does seem the most likely vehicle," she agreed. "Though, as you point out, Inspector, others have partaken without ill effect, which suggests either that the poison was added to this particular portion after it was poured, or—" She paused, her attention caught by something at the rim of the jug. A faint residue clung to the pottery, barely visible but distinctly present when viewed through her glass. "Or perhaps the contamination was more localized than we initially supposed," she continued. "This jug shows signs of having been rinsed, though not perhaps as thoroughly as one might wish." Lady Bantry approached to peer over her friend's shoulder. "Rinsed? But surely Mrs. Pierce would have cleaned all the serving vessels properly before use." "Oh, I'm quite certain she did," Miss Marple replied. "But you see, my dear, there are different sorts of rinsing. One might rinse a jug to remove soap or cleaning solution, for instance. And if that rinsing were hasty or incomplete—" Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination with sharp interest. "You're thinking the poison might have been introduced through residual cleaning materials?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said carefully, though of course one would need to understand exactly when and where such rinsing might have taken place. The implications of this observation settled upon the group like a cloud passing over the sun. If the poisoning had occurred through contaminated cleaning materials, it suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the case from a possible accident into something far more sinister. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with the authority of a man reasserting control over his investigation. "We'll need to question everyone who had access to the refreshment area, particularly Mrs. Pierce, and we'll want to know exactly who else might have handled that jug between the time it was prepared and when it reached the deceased." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Pierce herself appeared at the doorway of the Summerhouse, her usually composed features marked by obvious distress. Behind her hovered Claude Denham, his theatrical sensibilities clearly overwhelmed by the proximity of real drama. "Inspector," Mrs. Pierce began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've just heard the dreadful news. That poor man, and to think he might have been drinking my lemonade when— Is it true that he's been poisoned?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple noticed how Claude Denham's hands tightened convulsively on the brown paper parcel he still carried, the parcel containing the remainder of the artificial snow that now lay scattered so mysteriously about the sealed summerhouse. Chapter 4. The Lemon Zest That Wasn't Yellow. Mrs. Pierce's arrival at the summerhouse brought with it the sort of nervous energy that accompanies those who find themselves unexpectedly at the center of serious events. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years with the capable hands and direct manner of one, accustomed to managing village committees and organizing charitable functions. Yet now those same steady hands trembled as she twisted her apron strings into anxious knots. "I cannot understand how such a thing could have happened," she declared, her voice rising with each word. "My lemonade has been served at every village function for the past 15 years without so much as a stomach upset. I pride myself on using only the finest ingredients and the most careful preparation." Inspector Slack emerged from the summerhouse, with his notebook at the ready, the expression of a man preparing to conduct what he clearly hoped would be a straightforward interrogation. The presence of Mrs. Pierce offered the possibility of simple answers to what had become an increasingly complex situation. "Now then, Mrs. Pierce," he began in his most official tone, "I'll need you to walk me through exactly how you prepared the lemonade this morning. Every detail, mind you. Lives may depend upon it." Mrs. Pierce drew herself up with the dignity of the wrongly accused. "I arrived at the hall at 7 this morning to begin preparations. Lady Bantry had kindly provided the use of her kitchen facilities, and I brought my own lemons, 2 dozen of the finest I could obtain from Harris's shop in Much Benham." Miss Marple, who had been observing this exchange with her customary quiet attention, moved closer to the pottery jug that remained on the small table beside the deceased. Something about the residue clinging to its rim continued to trouble her, though she could not immediately articulate the source of her concern. "The lemons were particularly good this week," Mrs. Pierce continued, warming to her subject despite the circumstances. "Beautifully ripe and heavy with juice. I squeezed them myself, naturally, and added just the right amount of sugar and water. My secret, as I've often said, is to include a generous amount of zest for that extra sharpness that cuts through the heat." "Zest?" Miss Marple inquired gently, lifting the jug to examine its contents more closely. "You grated the rind into the mixture?" "Oh, yes, indeed. Nothing gives lemonade that proper tang quite like fresh lemon zest. I always use more than most people would dare. Strips of the yellow rind that I pare myself with a sharp knife." Miss Marple had raised the jug to her lips and was examining the remaining liquid with the sort of careful attention she might have devoted to a particularly complex knitting pattern. After a moment's hesitation, she touched her tongue delicately to the rim where a few drops of the lemonade had left their sticky residue. "Jane!" Lady Bantry exclaimed in shock. "Whatever are you doing? If that's been poisoned, just the merest taste." "Just a precaution," Miss Marple assured her friend, though her expression had grown decidedly thoughtful. "Most illuminating, I must say." She paused, her brow furrowing with concentration. "Mrs. Pierce, you mentioned strips of yellow rind. Are you quite certain about the color?" Mrs. Pierce looked bewildered by the question. "The color? Well, naturally it was yellow. Lemon rind is always yellow, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed. Yet what I observe floating in this particular mixture appears to be rather more white than yellow, almost as if someone had included rather too much of the bitter white pith along with the zest. Dr. Haydock, who had been completing his preliminary examination of the deceased, looked up with sharp interest. White pith would certainly account for additional bitterness in the mixture, quite effective for masking other flavors, medicinal ones, for instance. The implications of this observation were not lost on Inspector Slack, whose notebook emerged once more with mechanical precision. Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that someone deliberately added extra pith to disguise the taste of poison? I'm merely observing what appears to be present, Miss Marple replied with her customary caution, though I confess it does seem an unusual oversight for someone of Mrs. Pierce's evident expertise. Mrs. Pierce's face had grown pale as the conversation progressed, and she now sank heavily onto one of the wicker chairs that had been moved from the Summerhouse during the investigation. I swear to you, Inspector, that I prepared that lemonade exactly as I always do. The same recipe, the same care, the same ingredients I've used for years without incident. Claude Denham, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, while clutching his parcel of artificial snow, suddenly stepped forward with the air of a man compelled to speak. Perhaps, he suggested hesitantly, someone might have tampered with the mixture after Mrs. Pierce prepared it. The refreshment area was quite busy this morning, with people coming and going to help with the arrangements. Quite right, Lady Bantry confirmed. There were at least a dozen volunteers helping to set up the various stalls. Anyone might have had access to the lemonade while Mrs. Pierce was occupied elsewhere. Inspector Slack seized upon this possibility with evident relief. Exactly. What I was thinking. We'll need a complete list of everyone who was in the vicinity of the refreshment preparations this morning. Miss Marple, however, continued to study the jug with thoughtful concentration. Inspector, might I suggest that we also inquire about where this particular jug was cleaned and prepared for use? The residue I observed earlier suggests it may have been rinsed somewhere other than Lady Bantry's scullery. Rinsed elsewhere? Mrs. Pierce looked genuinely puzzled. But I cleaned all the serving vessels myself in Lady Bantry's kitchen. I would never trust such important work to others. Oh, I'm quite certain you did, Miss Marple assured her. But this jug shows signs of having been rinsed again after your initial cleaning, and not necessarily with the same care you would have employed. The group had gathered in a rough circle around the evidence, each face reflecting varying degrees of confusion, concern, and calculation. The afternoon sun continued to beat down mercilessly, and the distant sounds of the village fete seemed to drift from another world entirely. Dr. Haydock closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. I'll need to conduct proper tests to confirm the presence of poison and identify its nature. But based on the symptoms and the smell, I'm increasingly convinced we're dealing with some form of nicotine-based insecticide. Insecticide? Claude Denham's voice carried a note of particular concern. But surely no one would have access to such dangerous substances at a village fete. On the contrary, Inspector Slack replied grimly, half the households in St. Mary, Mead probably have tins of the stuff stored in their garden sheds. It's commonly used for treating aphids and other garden pests. Miss Marple had moved to examine the overturned silver cup that lay near the deceased's chair. Mrs. Pierce's prize. For lemon curd gleamed in the filtered sunlight, its engraved inscription clearly visible. Mrs. Pierce, she said suddenly, this cup of yours, how did it come to be in the Summerhouse? Surely you would have kept your prize safely at home rather than bringing it to the fete. Mrs. Pierce looked startled by the question, but I didn't. Bring it? I left it on my kitchen mantelpiece this morning, safe and sound. I have no idea how it came to be here. The mystery of the silver cup added yet another layer of complexity to an already puzzling situation. As the shadows lengthened across the garden, and the voices from the fete grew more distant, it became increasingly clear that what had appeared to be a simple case of accidental poisoning was revealing itself to be something far more intricate and deliberately planned. Chapter 5. A Parcel from the Dramatics Cupboard. The mystery of Mrs. Pierce's silver cup had cast a new shadow over the proceedings, and Inspector Slack found himself facing the uncomfortable realization that what he had hoped would prove a straightforward case was developing complications at an alarming rate. He turned his attention to Claude Denim, who still stood clutching the brown paper parcel with an air of increasing nervousness. "Right then, Mr. Denham," Slack began with the weary authority of a man determined to establish some semblance of order. "Let's have a look at this parcel of yours. You mentioned it contains artificial snow from the Dramatic Society's property cupboard." Claude's grip on the package tightened perceptibly, his knuckles showing white against the brown paper. "Yes, indeed. Soap flakes, actually. We use them for the snow scene in our Christmas production. Perfectly harmless theatrical property, I assure you." "May I?" Miss Marple inquired gently, extending her hands toward the parcel. Something about Claude's reluctance to relinquish his hold upon it had caught her attention, though she could not yet articulate why. With obvious reluctance, Claude surrendered the package. Miss Marple examined it with the methodical care she brought to all things that puzzled her, noting the way the brown paper had been folded and secured with string. "How interesting," she murmured, turning the parcel over in her hands. "The knot is tied in quite a distinctive manner, rather flat and snug. The sort of knot one might expect from someone who works regularly with stage rigging and theatrical equipment." Claude shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Well, naturally, I've been handling props and scenery for the better part of 20 years. One develops certain habits." "Indeed one does," Miss Marple agreed, "though this particular style of knot is more commonly employed by left-handed individuals. The way the final loop is secured, you see, it requires a specific manipulation that comes naturally to those who favor their left hand." Lady Bantry looked puzzled by this observation. "But surely Claude is right-handed, Jane. I've watched him countless times at village functions, writing in the visitor's book, handling his teacup. He's definitely right-handed." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle persistence that those who knew her had learned to respect. "Oh, I quite agree, my dear, which makes this knot rather remarkable, doesn't it? Either Mr. Denham has developed the unusual habit of tying knots with his non-dominant hand, or someone else retied this parcel," Dr. Haydock finished, his medical training making him quick to grasp the implications. Claude's face had grown noticeably pale, and his hands fluttered nervously at his sides. Well, that is to say, my wife Sylvia did help me secure it this morning. She's quite particular about such things, you know. Perhaps she retied it to her satisfaction." "How thoughtful of her," Miss Marple observed, "though one wonders why it needed retying at all if you had already secured it properly." Inspector Slack, sensing an opportunity to establish some concrete facts, stepped forward with renewed purpose. "Let's have a look at what's inside, shall we?" The unwrapping revealed a collection of white soap flakes exactly as Claude had described. They appeared to be ordinary household cleaning materials repurposed for theatrical effect, innocent enough, say, for their curious presence scattered throughout the sealed summerhouse. Miss Marple examined a small portion of the flakes, noting their texture and scent. "Lavender," she observed. "The soap has a distinct lavender fragrance. Quite pleasant, actually." "We always try to use quality materials for our productions," Claude said, his voice carrying a note of professional pride despite his obvious discomfort. "The audience may not notice such details, but they contribute to the overall effect." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed. "And when did you fetch this particular parcel from the dramatics cupboard?" Early this morning, Claude replied promptly. I arrived at the hall around 8 to help with the setup. I thought the artificial snow would add a nice touch to the Christmas in July display. And you brought it directly here? Claude hesitated, his eyes darting toward his wife, who had appeared at the edge of the group with a sort of silent precision that suggested she had been listening to the conversation for some time. Well, not directly, he admitted. I left it by the Summerhouse for convenience while I helped with the heavier work of setting up the stalls. It seemed a safe enough place, out of the way but easily accessible when needed. Sylvia Denham stepped forward, her sharp features composed but her eyes watchful. I helped arrange the Christmas display, she said in her precise, clipped tones. Claude had quite enough to manage without worrying about every small detail. Miss Marple studied Sylvia with the sort of attention she usually reserved for particularly complex cable patterns. There was something about the woman's controlled demeanor that suggested depths beneath the surface. Not necessarily sinister depths, but certainly complex ones. How helpful of you, Mrs. Denham. And did you handle the parcel yourself during the arrangement of the display? I may have moved it once or twice, Sylvia replied carefully. One can hardly avoid touching things when organizing a proper display. Inspector? Slack had been examining the remaining contents of the parcel, noting the quantity of soap flakes and their general condition. Seems to be about half empty, he observed. Would that account for what we found scattered in the Summerhouse? More than enough, Dr. Haydock confirmed. Though I must say, the distribution pattern we observed seemed remarkably even for something scattered by accident. Young Tom Briggs, who had been standing quietly at the periphery of the group, suddenly cleared his throat with the awkward determination of someone unused to speaking in adult company. Begging your pardon, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I might have seen something that could be important. All eyes turned to the young gardener, whose face had flushed deep red under the sudden attention. He shuffled his sock-clad feet nervously on the flagstone path. I was working on the trellis repair behind the Summerhouse earlier this morning, Tom continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. Around 9, perhaps a bit after, I saw Mr. Denham near the building, and he seemed to be doing something with his hands, like he was practicing some sort of motion over and over. Claude's face had gone from pale to ashen. Practicing? I'm sure. I don't know what the boy means. I was simply, well, one does gesture when thinking through problems, doesn't one? Miss Marple's expression had grown thoughtful. Tom, could you demonstrate what you observed? The sort of motions Mr. Denham was making. Tom looked around nervously, then raised his hands and made a series of careful movements, as though manipulating something delicate and precise, something that required coordination and practice. Rather like he was working with strings or chords, Tom explained, the sort of thing you do if you were trying to get the timing just right for something important. The implications of Tom's observation settled over the group like a chill wind. In the distance, the sounds of the village fete continued, a reminder that while they grappled with questions of murder and deception, the ordinary world carried on in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding in the ivy-covered Summerhouse. Chapter 6. Seed packet with sand, not seeds. Tom Briggs's demonstration of the peculiar hand movements he had witnessed sent a ripple of unease through the assembled group. The young gardener, having delivered his testimony, seemed to shrink back into himself, clearly uncomfortable with the attention his observations had drawn. His stocking feet shifted nervously on the warm flagstones, and Miss Marple noticed that he kept one hand pressed protectively against his jacket pocket. Tom, she said gently, her voice carrying the sort of maternal authority that had comforted countless village children over the years. You mentioned you were working on a trellis repair this morning. Might I ask what tools you were using for the task? The young man's face brightened slightly at this return to familiar territory. Oh, just the usual, Miss Marple. Hammer, some wire for binding, a few wooden stakes to replace the broken ones. Nothing fancy, you understand? Of course, Miss Marple agreed. And I suppose you would have needed some method of securing the new post firmly in place? Yes, miss. I use sand. For setting the base of the supports, helps them stay steady until the soil packs down properly around them. Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly impatient with what he clearly viewed as irrelevant gardening discussion, cleared his throat pointedly. All very interesting, I'm sure, but we have more pressing matters to— Inspector, Miss Marple interrupted with unusual firmness. I believe Tom's work may be quite relevant to our investigation. Tom, dear, might I see what you have in your pocket? The one you keep touching? Tom's face flushed scarlet, and his hand moved instinctively to shield the pocket in question. It's nothing important, Miss Marple, just a bit of sand for the garden work. Sand? Dr. Haydock inquired with professional curiosity. Carried in your pocket? Well, you see, Tom stammered, his discomfort evident. I keep it in an old seed packet for convenience. Makes it easy to pour just the right amount where it's needed. Miss Marple's eyes had taken on the bright, alert quality that Lady Bantry had learned to associate with significant discoveries. How very practical of you, Tom, though I confess I'm curious. Where did you obtain this sand? It's not the sort of thing one typically finds lying about Gossington Hall's well-maintained grounds. Tom's reluctance to answer was palpable, but under Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning, the truth gradually emerged. I fetched it yesterday evening from the Denham's garden shed. They have a supply for their rockery work, and Mr. Denham said I was welcome to help myself when needed. Claude Denham, who had been following this exchange with growing alarm, stepped forward with forced joviality. Quite right. Quite right. Always happy to help Lady Bantry's staff with their duties. Community spirit and all that. How generous, Miss Marple observed. And I suppose you visited the Denham's shed in the evening rather than during working hours? Around sunset. Yes, miss. Most conscientious, Miss Marple agreed. And was Mr. Denham present when you collected the sand? Tom's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. He was there when I arrived, actually. Seemed to be organizing things in the shed, moving boxes about, checking on various supplies. Very thorough he was. Sylvia Denham had been listening to this conversation with a sort of rigid attention that suggested more than casual interest. Now she spoke for the first time since Tom had begun his account. My husband takes great pride in maintaining an orderly workshop, she said, her voice carrying that precise, controlled quality that Miss Marple had noted earlier. He spent considerable time yesterday evening ensuring everything was properly arranged for today's festivities. How admirable, Miss Marple replied. Though I wonder, Tom, if you might show us this seed packet of yours. I confess to a great interest in gardening innovations. With obvious reluctance, Tom withdrew a small paper envelope from his pocket. It was the sort of packet commonly used for flower seeds, printed with cheerful illustrations of blooms and bearing the name of a well-known supplier. However, as Tom tilted it slightly, a thin stream of fine sand trickled from one corner rather than the seeds one might have expected. Miss Marple examined the packet with her customary thoroughness, noting the careful way it had been folded to prevent spillage and the slight weight that suggested it contained more than the few pinches of sand that would be needed for Tom's gardening tasks. Quite ingenious, she murmured. A very practical solution for carrying measured quantities of material, though I confess, Tom, This seems rather more sand than one would need for setting a few trellis posts. Well, that is, Tom floundered, his face growing redder by the moment. I thought it best to take extra in case I needed to repair other supports around the grounds. Dr. Haydock moved closer to examine the packet, his medical training making him naturally observant of unusual details. The sand appears to be quite fine-grained, he noted, almost powder-like in consistency, unusual for typical gardening applications. Claude Denham's agitation had become increasingly apparent throughout this discussion. His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his handkerchief, and his eyes darted repeatedly between Tom and the seed packet, as though calculating possibilities and outcomes. "I say," he interjected with forced heartiness, "surely we're making rather too much of simple gardening supplies. The boy needed sand, I provided it. Nothing more complicated than neighborly assistance." Miss Marple, however, continued to study the packet with thoughtful concentration. Something about its weight and the way the sand moved within it reminded her of theatrical props she'd seen in amateur productions, items designed to serve functions quite different from their apparent purpose. "Tom," she said suddenly, "when you observed Mr. Denham's hand movements this morning, did they seem similar to motions someone might make when manipulating small weights or measured quantities of material?" Tom considered this question with the serious attention of youth providing important testimony. "Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, yes, rather like he was practicing pouring something very carefully, or maybe working with strings that had weights attached." "Weights?" Inspector Slack repeated, his notebook emerging once more. "What sort of weights would one need at a village fete?" "In theatrical work," Miss Marple observed mildly, "weights are often used to ensure that curtains fall properly or that mechanical effects occur at precisely the right moment." A theatrical mind would naturally think in terms of such technical requirements. The implications of this observation were not lost on anyone present. If Claude Denham had been practicing movements involving weights and precise timing, it suggested a level of premeditation that cast his morning activities in an entirely different light. Sylvia Denham's composure, which had remained largely intact throughout the investigation, showed the first signs of strain. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, and her carefully controlled expression flickered momentarily to reveal something approaching panic. "This is all supposition and coincidence," she said sharply. "My husband is a dedicated member of this community who has never harmed anyone. These wild theories based on gardening supplies and theatrical techniques are utterly ridiculous." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed that Sylvia's eyes kept returning to the seed packet in Tom's hands, as though it represented some threat she could not quite bring herself to name. The afternoon shadows had grown longer, and the sounds of the village fete seemed to come from an increasingly distant world, as the small group grappled with the growing evidence that Mr. Caro's death had been neither accidental nor spontaneous. In the distance, the church clock chimed 3 times, marking the passage of hours that had transformed a pleasant summer gathering into something far more sinister. The ivy-covered summerhouse, which had once seemed a charming retreat from the afternoon heat, now loomed over them like a monument to carefully planned deception. Chapter 7. The Curtain Cord, Tied the Wrong Way. The growing weight of circumstantial evidence had settled upon the group like the oppressive heat of the July afternoon, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to examine the interior of the summerhouse with fresh eyes. The artificial snow continued to glitter innocently on the rush matting, but its very presence had become a reproach to those who sought simple explanations for complex events. While Inspector Slack conducted a more detailed interrogation of Claude Denham regarding his activities that morning, Miss Marple quietly slipped back into the ivy-covered structure. The close air within seemed to hold secrets, and she moved with the careful deliberation of one who understood that important truths often revealed themselves in the smallest details. Her attention was caught by the muslin curtains that framed the diamond-paned windows. They were simple affairs, designed more for softening the harsh angles of the casements than for providing privacy, and they hung in gentle folds that spoke of Lady Bantry's attention to even the humblest corners of her property. Yet something about the way one curtain hung struck Miss Marple as distinctly odd. The cord that gathered the fabric had been tied in a manner that seemed awkward, almost as though it had been secured by someone working from an unusual angle or under difficult circumstances. She moved closer to examine the arrangement, her experienced eye noting the way the fabric had been drawn and the peculiar tension in the cord itself. The knot was positioned strangely, pulled tight against the window frame rather than hanging naturally, as one would expect from normal adjustment. "Most curious," she murmured to herself, reaching up to touch the cord with gentle fingers. The muslin has been gathered with more force than necessary, and the resulting fold suggests that someone had pulled the fabric from outside the window rather than from within the room. Dr. Haydock, who had completed his preliminary examination and was preparing to arrange for the removal of the deceased, noticed Miss Marple's absorbed study of the window treatment. "Found something significant?" he inquired, approaching with the quiet tread of one accustomed to moving carefully around scenes of death. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice carrying that note of cautious speculation that had become familiar to those involved in the investigation. "It's the curtain. Cord, you see. It's been tied in quite the wrong way for someone working from inside the room." She demonstrated her observation by reaching up to adjust the cord herself, showing how natural movement would position the knot and arrange the fabric. The contrast with the existing arrangement was immediately apparent. "You're suggesting someone manipulated the curtain from outside?" Dr. Haydock asked, following her reasoning with professional interest. "It would appear so," Miss Marple confirmed, though one wonders why anyone would need to adjust window treatments from the exterior of the building. Her gaze had moved to the base of the door, where she noticed something that had escaped earlier observation. The gap beneath the wooden frame was wider than one might expect, perhaps the result of settling, or the natural expansion and contraction of materials in the English climate. "Dr. Haydock," she said suddenly, "might I ask you to examine this space beneath the door? I believe you'll find it quite revealing." The doctor knelt to study the gap Miss Marple indicated, his medical training making him naturally methodical. In his observations, after a moment he looked up with surprise. "The gap is certainly substantial," he agreed. "Wide enough, I should think, to pass a thin cord or string underneath with relative ease." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "Precisely what I was thinking. And if one were to pass a string under the door and attach it to the inner latch mechanism, one could conceivably operate that latch from outside the room." The implications of this discovery sent a chill through both observers. "But surely," Dr. Haydock protested, "such a mechanism would require considerable skill to operate effectively. One would need to know exactly how the latch functioned and precisely how much force to apply." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "The sort of skill that might come naturally to someone experienced in theatrical rigging and stage effects, someone who understood the precise manipulation of mechanical devices and the importance of exact timing." Inspector Slack's voice could be heard outside, growing increasingly sharp as his questioning of Claude Denime failed to produce satisfactory answers. The theatrical quartermaster's responses had become more evasive with each inquiry, and his nervous energy had escalated to the point where even his wife's composed presence seemed insufficient to calm him. Miss Marple moved to the window that faced the main garden, studying the view that Mr. Caro would have commanded from his final resting place. The perspective encompassed the entire fete, from the bustling refreshment area to the quieter corners where individual stalls displayed their wares. A perfect vantage point, she observed. One could observe the entire gathering from here without being easily seen in return. You think that's why he came here? Dr. Haydock asked. To observe rather than to make a telephone call as he claimed? Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, he was lured here by someone who understood his character well enough to know he couldn't resist such an opportunity for surveillance. The afternoon heat had begun to take its toll on everyone involved. In the investigation, and the sounds of the village fete had grown more subdued as participants sought shade and refreshment. Yet the drama unfolding around the Summerhouse seemed to exist in its own isolated sphere, removed from the innocent pleasures of the gathering. Lady Bantry appeared in the doorway, her usually composed features showing the strain of hosting what had become a most unusual social event. "Jane, dear," she said quietly, "Inspector Slack is asking for you. He seems to have reached some sort of impasse with Mr. Denham." Miss Marple took one final look around the interior of the Summerhouse, her eyes recording details that might prove significant as the investigation progressed. The scattered artificial snow, the overturned silver cup, the peculiarly arranged curtain, each element contributed to a picture that was becoming clearer with each revelation. As she prepared to rejoin the group outside, her attention was caught by something she had not noticed before. A tiny fragment of string caught on a splinter near the base of the door frame. It was barely visible, no more than a few threads, but its presence suggested that her theory about the latch mechanism might be more than mere speculation. She carefully extracted the fragment and examined it closely. The material appeared to be ordinary household twine, the sort commonly used for parcels or light-binding tasks. Yet its position and the way it had been caught suggested that it had been pulled forcefully through the gap beneath the door. "Most illuminating," she murmured, tucking the fragment carefully into her reticule. The evidence was beginning to form a pattern, and that pattern pointed inexorably toward a conclusion that would transform the apparent mystery of the locked room into something far more mundane, but infinitely more sinister. Outside, Inspector Slack's interrogation had reached a crescendo of frustration, and Claude Denim's protestations of innocence had taken the desperate quality of a man who saw his carefully constructed alibi crumbling before his eyes. The afternoon that had begun with such innocent pleasures was drawing toward a conclusion that none of the participants could have anticipated. Miss Marple emerged from the Summerhouse with the quiet confidence of one who had found the key to a particularly challenging puzzle. The solution was not yet complete, but the essential elements were falling into place with the inexorable logic that she had learned to trust over many years of observing human nature in all its complexity. Chapter 8. A Jug That Smelled Faintly. Of Lavender. Dr. Haydock's return from Much Benham, with the preliminary results of his hastily conducted tests, brought a new gravity to the investigation. The police surgeon had confirmed what his initial examination had suggested. Mr. Caro had indeed died from nicotine poisoning, administered in sufficient concentration to prove rapidly fatal. "No question about the cause of death," Dr. Haydock announced to the assembled group. The substance was almost certainly derived from a common garden insecticide, the sort of concentrated nicotine solution sold under various trade names for treating aphids and other pests. Inspector Slack received this confirmation with the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been validated. "Right then, we're definitely looking at murder, not accident. The question now is how the poison was administered and by whom." Miss Marple, who had been quietly contemplating the pottery jug that had contained the fatal lemonade, looked up with renewed interest. "Dr. Haydock, you mentioned that such insecticides are commonly available. Might I ask what form they typically take? Usually a dark, oily concentrate, the doctor replied. Quite pungent, with a distinctly bitter taste that would be difficult to disguise in any ordinary beverage. Unless, Miss Marple observed gently, one took particular care to mask both the appearance and the flavor through careful preparation. She lifted the jug once more, holding it closer to her nose, with the delicate caution of one who understood the potential dangers involved. The faint aroma that had puzzled her earlier had become more distinct now that the initial shock of discovery had passed. Lavender, she announced with quiet certainty. The jug carries a distinct scent of lavender soap, not the natural fragrance of the herb, but the artificial perfume used in commercial cleaning products. Mrs. Pierce, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout much of the investigation, looked up with sharp attention. But that's impossible, Miss Marple. I cleaned all the serving vessels myself in Lady Bantry's scullery, using nothing but hot water and ordinary washing soap. I would never use anything with such a strong scent for food preparation. Oh, I'm quite certain you wouldn't, Miss Marple assured her. Your reputation for careful food handling is well established. But you see, the lavender scent I detect is not from washing soap at all. It's from the artificial snow we've been discussing. She gestured toward the brown paper parcel that Claude Denham had brought from the Dramatic Society's property cupboard. Those soap flakes are scented with lavender. As Mr. Denham mentioned earlier, if this jug had been rinsed in an area where such flakes were being handled, traces of that distinctive fragrance would certainly linger. The implications of this observation were immediately apparent to everyone present. If the lemonade jug bore traces of lavender-scented soap flakes, it suggested that someone had subjected it to an additional cleaning process after Mrs. Pierce's careful preparation. Claude Denham's face had gone ashen, and his hands trembled as he attempted to light a cigarette with obvious desperation. That is to say, I may have helped carry some of the refreshment supplies this morning. Community spirit, you understand. Always willing to lend a hand. How generous of you, Miss Marple replied, with a sort of gentle approval that somehow made her next question all the more pointed. And did this assistance include handling the lemonade jug after Mrs. Pierce's preparation? Well, perhaps I did carry it back to the refreshment area after Mrs. Pierce had finished with it. She seemed quite overwhelmed with all the preparations, and I thought it might be helpful to— His voice trailed off as he realized the trap into which his explanation had led him. If he had indeed handled the jug after Mrs. Pierce's preparation, it provided the perfect opportunity for contamination, with both the lavender-scented soap and the deadly insecticide. Sylvia Denham had been watching this exchange with the rigid attention of a woman witnessing the collapse of carefully laid plans. Now, she stepped forward with a controlled desperation of someone attempting to salvage an impossible situation. My husband was merely trying to be helpful. He carries cleaning supplies for the Dramatic Society as part of his regular duties. If the jug was contaminated, it was surely an accident, a terrible coincidence. Miss Marple studied Sylvia with the sort of gentle but penetrating gaze that had unraveled many secrets over the years. I'm sure Mr. Denham's intentions were entirely helpful, though I confess I'm curious about the timing of this assistance. Mrs. Pierce, when exactly did you finish preparing the lemonade? Mrs. Pierce consulted the small watch pinned to her apron with the precision of someone accustomed to managing complex schedules. I completed everything by 9 this morning. The jug was filled and ready for service well before the festivities began. And when did you next see the jug, Mr. Denham? Miss Marple inquired with polite interest. Claude's cigarette had gone out and he fumbled with his matches while attempting to formulate a response. I noticed it sitting in the preparation area around perhaps 10 days. Mrs. Pierce seemed to have stepped away for a moment, and I thought it might be safer to move it to a more secure location." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple agreed. "And where did you take it for this more secure storage?" "Just to the side table near the Christmas display," Claude replied, his voice growing smaller with each admission. "I thought it would be safe there until needed for service." Dr. Haydock had been following this exchange with growing understanding. So the jug was moved from Mrs. Pierce's preparation area to a location near the artificial snow display, a location where soap flakes were being handled and where insecticide residue might easily be introduced. The chain of events was becoming clearer with each revelation. Claude's access to both the lemonade and the means of contamination, combined with his obvious knowledge of theatrical techniques for creating locked room mysteries, painted a picture that even Inspector Slack could no longer ignore. "Right then, Mr. Denham," Slack announced with the authority of a man finally seeing clear ground ahead. "I think you'd better come with me for a more formal discussion of your activities this morning." But Miss Marple held up a gentle hand to forestall the arrest. "Inspector, if I might suggest, there are still several elements of this puzzle that require clarification. The method of administering the poison is becoming clear, but the question of motive remains unaddressed." Lady Bantry, who had been observing these proceedings with the fascinated horror of one watching her peaceful village, transformed into the setting for a murder investigation, spoke up with sudden recollection. "I remember now. Mr. Carow mentioned something at last week's parish council meeting about purchasing property for development. He seemed particularly interested in the land behind the Denham's cottage." Sylvia Denham's composure finally cracked at this revelation. "He was trying to force us to sell," she burst out, her carefully controlled voice rising to a near shriek. "He held debts over my husband's head and threatened to ruin us if we didn't cooperate with his development schemes." The motive, long hidden beneath layers of village politeness and social convention, had finally emerged into the harsh light of afternoon revelation. As the shadows lengthened across Gossington Hall's lawns, the full scope of the morning's carefully orchestrated deception began to unfold before the assembled witnesses. Chapter 9. Snow that wouldn't melt on the tongue. Sylvia Denham's outburst had shattered the careful veneer of respectability that had surrounded the investigation. And in the uncomfortable silence that followed, Miss Marple found herself studying the artificial snow with renewed fascination. Something about its distribution continued to trouble her, though the precise nature of her concern remained tantalizingly beyond articulation. With the sort of deliberate movement that those who knew her had learned to interpret as significant, Miss Marple bent down and carefully selected a single flake from the rush matting. She examined it closely, noting its texture and consistency with a methodical attention she usually reserved for identifying dropped stitches in complex knitting patterns. "Most unladylike, Jane," Lady Bantry murmured with the automatic disapproval of one who had spent decades maintaining proper social standards, even in the most unusual circumstances. Miss Marple paid no attention to her friend's reproach. Instead, she raised the flake toward her mouth with a cautious deliberation of someone conducting a scientific experiment. "Jane!" Lady Bantry exclaimed in genuine alarm. "Whatever are you thinking? After all our discussion of poison and contamination, but—" Miss Marple had already touched the flake to her tongue, her expression growing thoughtful as she considered the taste. "Sap, not sugar," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly as one would expect from cleaning materials repurposed for theatrical effect." Inspector Slack looked up from his notebook with the weary expression of a man who had long since ceased to be surprised by Miss Marple's unconventional investigative methods. "And what exactly does that tell us, Miss Marple? We already knew thy snow was artificial." "Indeed we did," Miss Marple agreed. But you see, Inspector, the truly interesting observation is not what I tasted, but where I found this particular flake. She gestured toward the interior threshold of the summerhouse, where the artificial snow lay in what appeared to be natural drifts. These flakes on the inner sill have remained completely undisturbed throughout our investigation. They lie exactly as they settled, with no evidence of foot traffic or disturbance. Dr. Haydock, whose medical training had taught him to appreciate precise observation, moved closer to examine the area Miss Marple indicated. You're quite right. The snow on the inner threshold is pristine, almost as though it had been arranged rather than scattered randomly. Exactly my thought, Miss Marple replied. But if we examine the outer sill, she moved to the exterior threshold and pointed to a subtle but distinct smearing in the white powder. Here we find evidence of deliberate manipulation. Someone has tipped flakes inward from outside the summerhouse. The implications of this discovery were immediately apparent. If the artificial snow had been scattered into the room from outside after Mr. Caro's death, it suggested a level of staging that transformed the entire scene from the aftermath of a spontaneous crime into something far more calculated. But why? Lady Bantry asked, her voice carrying the bewilderment of someone struggling to understand the criminal mind. Why go to such elaborate lengths to scatter soap flakes about a room? To create confusion, my dear, Miss Marple replied, and perhaps to establish false evidence of who might have been present in the room. She knelt beside the ribbed impressions that had puzzled her earlier, studying them with the concentrated attention of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle. These prints that we attributed to wool socks, I believe we may have been partially correct in our identification, but entirely wrong in our interpretation. Inspector Slack approached, with obvious reluctance, clearly anticipating another theory that would complicate his investigation. Wrong? How, Miss Marple? We assumed these prints were made by someone who had removed their shoes. Young Tom, perhaps, or another person who might naturally walk about in stocking feet. But consider another possibility. What if these impressions were made deliberately, by someone wearing wool socks over their shoes, for the specific purpose of creating this distinctive pattern? Dr. Haydock's eyes widened with understanding. You're suggesting someone dusted their feet with powder and walked carefully through the room to leave false evidence? Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. The ribbed pattern is too clear, too distinct, for natural impressions made by someone moving normally about the room. These prints were made by someone walking very deliberately, placing each step with theatrical precision. Claude Denime had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, his earlier cigarette long forgotten as ash scattered down his waistcoat. This is all pure speculation, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You're reading far too much into simple coincidences. Miss Marple turned to study him with the sort of gentle but penetrating gaze that had unraveled many carefully constructed deceptions. Mr. Denham, in your work with the Dramatic Society, you must be familiar with the various techniques used to create realistic stage effects. Powder for aging makeup, for instance, or materials for simulating snow and other weather conditions. Well, naturally, Claude replied with defensive professional pride. Any competent stage manager understands such techniques. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. And I suspect someone with your expertise would also know that actors sometimes dust their shoes with powder to prevent slipping on smooth stage surfaces. A practical consideration that might leave distinctive ribbed impressions when walking across a powdered floor. The net of evidence was tightening around Claude with inexorable precision, and his wife's composure had deteriorated, to the point where she could no longer maintain her facade of calm observation. Sylvia's hands trembled as she twisted her wedding ring and her eyes darted between her husband and the various pieces of evidence that had accumulated against him. "The timing troubles me as well," Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. "At 12:45 this morning, when several witnesses placed you on the far lawn during the teddy bear's picnic, the gramophone was playing quite loudly. Perfect cover for any small sounds that might emanate from the Summerhouse area." Inspector Slack had been scribbling furiously in his notebook, and now he looked up with the expression of a man finally seeing a clear path forward. "You're saying Denham staged the whole scene? The locked room, the scattered snow, the false footprints, all while he had a perfect alibi for the crucial time?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that alibis often cover the wrong moments. If Mr. Caro was already dead and the room already sealed by 12:45, then Mr. Denham's presence on the lawn at that time merely confirms his whereabouts during the final staging of the scene, not during the actual commission of the crime." The afternoon. Heat had grown oppressive, and the distant sounds of the village fete seemed to drift from another world entirely. The cheerful bustle of community celebration provided a stark contrast to the grim drama unfolding around the ivy-covered summerhouse, where carefully laid plans were crumbling under the weight of meticulous observation. Young Tom Briggs, who had been standing quietly at the periphery of the group throughout these revelations, suddenly stepped forward with the awkward determination of someone compelled to speak an uncomfortable truth. "Begging your pardon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I think I might know where Mr. Denham got the powder for dusting his socks." Chapter 10. Evening Song on the Green and the Hand That Shook the Sieve. The shadows of evening had begun to stretch across Gossington Hall's lawns, and from the village green came the gentle sound of hymns as the faithful gathered for evening song. The contrast between those peaceful melodies and the grim tableau around the summerhouse seemed to emphasize the distance they had all traveled from the innocent pleasures of the morning's fete. Tom Briggs's revelation about the powder had provided the final piece of evidence Inspector Slack required. The young gardener had remembered seeing Claude Denham handling a tin of brassica powder in the Dramatic Society's property cupboard, a substance commonly used by actors to prevent foot slippage on polished stages, and precisely the sort of material that would create the distinctive ribbed impressions they discovered in the artificial snow. Miss Marple stood quietly contemplating the scene before her, organizing the various elements of the crime into a coherent narrative. The evening breeze stirred the ivy that covered the summerhouse walls, and she reflected on how often the most complex mysteries revealed themselves to be surprisingly simple once properly understood. "Inspector," she said finally, "I believe the time has come to set out exactly what transpired here this morning." Inspector Slack, who had been preparing to place Claude Denham under formal arrest, paused with obvious relief. Despite his frequent protestations about amateur interference, he had learned to value Miss Marple's ability to organize complex evidence into comprehensible patterns. "The method," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of one who had thought through every detail, "was both ingenious and methodical. Mr. Caro was murdered by nicotine insecticide dissolved into his glass of lemonade. The bitterness, masked by an overabundance of bitter white pith rather than proper yellow zest, and a jug that had been rinsed where soap flakes lingered to create foam that would hide the oily swirl of the poison. Claude Denham had sunk onto one of the wicker chairs that had been moved from the summerhouse, his face ashen and his hands trembling uncontrollably. Beside him, Sylvia maintained her rigid composure, though her eyes had taken on the hollow quality of someone watching the collapse of everything she had tried to protect. "The locked door," Miss Marple continued, "was achieved through theatrical technique. The inner thumb latch pulled down from outside using thin string slipped under the door, which was then snapped free to leave no obvious evidence. The neatness of the scene was carefully staged to discourage close examination. She gestured toward the scattered artificial snow that had puzzled them throughout the investigation. The soap flakes were sieved in afterward, hence their presence on top of the inner latch, to create a picturesque scene that would suggest accident rather than design, and to establish false evidence through the ribbed footprint impressions. Doctor. Haydock nodded with professional appreciation, the powder on the wool socks to create those distinctive prints. Quite clever, actually. It would have pointed suspicion away from someone wearing normal shoes. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Denham had access to nicotine insecticide through the Dramatic Society's property storage, where garden sprays are kept for treating stage sets. The brown paper parcel bears evidence of having been retied by someone left-handed, his wife, Sylvia, to conceal the fact that it had been opened and some contents removed. Sylvia's composure finally cracked completely at this revelation. I only retied it because Claude came home so agitated last night, she burst out. He had soap flakes on his cuffs and was muttering about strings and timing. I thought it was just his usual theatrical fussing, until I smelled the lavender on the lemonade jug this morning. The telltale evidence, Miss Marple observed sadly, was indeed the scent. No one handling plain lemonade would leave such a distinctive fragrance, unless they had been working with the artificial snow first. When Mr. Denham offered to help, by carrying the clean jug back to the refreshment area, he had already contaminated it with both the soap scent and the poison. Inspector Slack had been taking detailed notes throughout this exposition, and now he looked up with grim satisfaction. Motive, Miss Marple? What drove him to such elaborate murder? Financial desperation? Miss Marple replied simply. Mr. Caro was pressing to force the sale of the Denham's property to access the Hall's spinney for development. More significantly, he held a pre-war promissory note from Claude's involvement in some questionable costume dealings and had begun making threats to Sylvia about exposure. Claude's head had dropped into his hands, and his voice emerged as little more than a whisper. Hi. Would have ruined us. The debt, the forced sale, the scandal. It would have destroyed everything we'd built here. So you planned to make it appear as though young Tom was responsible? Miss Marple continued with gentle reproach. The ribbed sock impressions, the scattered snow, even the seed packet filled with stage sand to suggest he had been practicing with weights for some theatrical prank. You counted on Inspector Slack's preference for obvious solutions. Lady Bantry had been listening to this recitation with growing horror. But Claude, how could you? Mr. Caro was unpleasant, certainly, but to plan such an elaborate deception. It wasn't supposed to be so complicated, Claude said desperately. I only meant to silence him, to buy us time to find another solution. But once I'd begun, each step seemed to require another, until the whole thing became this theatrical production. Miss Marple's expression carried the sort of gentle sadness she reserved for those who had allowed desperation to overcome their fundamental decency. The tragedy, Mr. Denham, is that your very expertise in stage management made the crime far more complex than necessary. A simpler approach might have gone undetected, but you could not resist the urge to create a perfect scene. Inspector Slack rose with a satisfied air of a man whose investigation had reached its proper conclusion. Claude Denham, I arrest you for the willful murder of Ambrose Caro. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As the formal words of arrest echoed across the evening garden, Sylvia Denham stepped forward with the dignity of a woman accepting her share of responsibility. I helped conceal the evidence, Inspector. I retied that parcel knowing something was wrong. I should be arrested as well. The sounds of evening song continued to drift across the grounds as the small procession made its way toward the house where a police car waited to transport the prisoners to Much Benham. The village fete had long since concluded, leaving behind only the scattered detritus of a day that had begun with such innocent intentions. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry remained behind in the gathering dusk, contemplating the ivy-covered summerhouse that had been the stage for such carefully orchestrated deception. So many picture postcard touches, Lady Bantry sighed, sipping from a glass of barley water that had appeared as if by magic from the depleted refreshment supplies. Snow in July, a locked door, a prize cup overturned. One felt quite guided through the whole performance. Miss Marple smiled with the weary satisfaction of one who had unraveled a particularly complex knitting pattern. That's the trouble with tidy clues, my dear. They are so often arranged. Real life, like real snow, falls where it chooses, not where someone thinks it ought to fall for dramatic effect. The evening star had appeared above the ancient oaks that bordered Gossington Hall, and the peaceful sounds of the countryside settled over them like a blessing after the day's revelations. Tomorrow would bring trials and judgments, newspaper, reporters and curious visitors, but for now there was only the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served, however sadly the circumstances that had made such justice necessary.